last 10 years, I've written 5 books. One of these has been my own, and the other 4 I've co-authored, which means that if you're somebody who has a story to tell, but you're not a writer, you may hire me to get inside your head and work with you and help you write your book. Throughout my career, I've been approached many times by people who, when they hear what I do, tell me that they've always wanted to write a book of their own, that they have a memoir or a novel that they're kind of just waiting to tell. And so the question comes, how do you get a book deal? How does something like that happen? What seminar do I need to sign up for? Or what classes do I need to take? Or who do I need to know? And my answer to this is I'm sure all of those things are really helpful and can be important, but I don't think they're what really matter in the end. Now, for me personally, I've never taken a writing course. I don't have a fancy writing degree. And at the time that I signed my first book contract, I had written one very short and very boring article in a local New York City magazine. But what I did have was a willingness to be something we're told we should never be, totally and completely unreasonable. Now, as somebody who's made a career out of telling other people's stories, I'm not that accustomed to telling my own, but that's what I'm going to do here today. My story of unreason began in September 2003, when I read a very short article in the New York Times about the arrest of a man named James E. James E. was a captain in the United States Army and was one of the first Muslim chaplains in the military. At the time of his arrest, he was serving at Guantanamo, which had just recently began operating as a detention center for al-Qaeda and Taliban fighters captured after 9/11. The story that I read was really disturbing. It said that James E., who had graduated from West Point, was being charged with espionage, spying, and possibly treason, because apparently at some point during the 10 months that he served at Guantanamo, he had decided to switch sides, and he had begun to collude with the detainees. The more I read, the more disturbing the story became. First, I read that when he was actually charged, it wasn't with espionage or with treason. Instead, it was with mishandling classified documents, a far less serious crime. But then that story changed. Those charges were dropped, and instead he was charged with 2 crimes, committing adultery and downloading pornography, which, believe it or not, are considered illegal in the United States military, though, as you might imagine, are rarely enforced. But then those charges were dropped. His record was wiped clean, and several months after his arrest, he was honorably discharged from the Army. Now, what I didn't read after this was the story that I wanted to read, the story that called into question what had happened, that looked at the incongruities here, that asked how could it be that a captain of the United States Army who happened to be Muslim went from being considered part of one of the most important spy rings in U.S. history to being honorably discharged from the Army. I mean, somebody had to write that story, right? It was unreasonable to think that that might be me. At the time that I read this, I was not a writer. I mean, I was a writer in the sense that I wrote, but it was mostly for myself. Because despite the fact that being a writer was what I wanted to do more than anything, I had accepted it wasn't going to happen for me, because I had been told it wasn't going to happen for me. Through the years, I'd written stories to magazines and newspapers and said, I'd love for you to publish this, and most of the time I never got a response. And the editors who were polite enough to write me back always wrote me back to say no. And so I had accepted this, and I had decided it wasn't happening. And with my stack of rejection letters, I instead went on to get a very practical degree and a really practical job, which I was working when I first read this article about James E., which is why I can only describe as what I did afterwards as totally and completely unreasonable. But I found the phone number of his parents, who lived about an hour outside of New York where I live, and I called them up and I asked them if I could come over and have coffee. Of course, they wanted to know who I wrote for before agreeing to an interview, and so I just told them the truth. I write for myself. The next day I sat at their kitchen table, and they showed me an evaluation that their son had received during his time at Guantanamo. It said that he was a tremendous asset to the mission there. It said that his commitment and loyalty to the work at Guantanamo was unquestionable. It said that he should be promoted at the first possible opportunity. It was the best evaluation he had ever received during his entire career in the military. And it was issued 2 days before he was arrested for allegedly being part of Al-Qaeda. This was enough to convince me that there was a bigger story here. And so I put aside every reasonable thought I had, and I tried to bury as much self-doubt as I could. And I decided that, yeah, maybe I was going to be the one to tell this story. It was unreasonable to think that I would get James E.'s high-powered military attorney to allow me, a self-described journalist who had 0 published articles, to come to DC and comb through boxes of court documents. But he said yes. It was unreasonable to think that when I called James E.'s friends and his colleagues and his old bosses and people who worked with him at Guantanamo, that they would talk to me. But they did. Now, eventually I knew if I was going to write the story, it would be nice if somebody would agree to publish it. So once again, unreasonably, I went back to the magazines, but this time I went for it. I sent letters off to the New Yorker and the Atlantic and Vanity Fair. It was an editor from Esquire who invited me in to talk. And a couple days later, he called with an offer. They wanted to do a big story on James E., but there were 2 conditions. 1, I had to get him to agree to an interview, and 2, they weren't going to let me write it. We're signing the piece out, the editor said. To who? I asked. To a real writer, he said, but you can help. I said, okay. James E., however, did not. Despite all of the email messages that I sent him and the millions of voicemails that I left, he never responded to me once. So when I went back to Esquire and told them it didn't look like James E. was going to cooperate, they told me that the story was dead. So unreasonably, I went back to more magazines. And this time, the New Republic said yes. They wanted to publish the piece. And this time, they weren't even going to give it to a real writer. They were going to give it to me. They were going to trust that even though I had no experience writing anything big like this for a national publication, that I knew how to do that. This, it turned out, was actually unreasonable because I totally screwed it up. During the fact-checking process, they discovered that I made 2 incredibly careless errors, like getting his age wrong. Of course, I tried to congratulate them on their incredible fact-checking skills. But I sort of had an idea what was coming. We've lost faith in you, the editor said. We're killing the piece. So I think at this point it was pretty clear what the reasonable thing to do was. The reasonable thing was to pay attention to the message that the universe was telling me and to return to my practical job and my practical life and to give this up, right? The next day I walked into my boss's office and I quit. When people asked me what I was going to do, I said I didn't know, but I did know. I was going to get a waitressing job to pay my bills, and I was going to try and somehow figure out how to turn all these yeses into nos. The last day my job was super weird. I spent the day going back and forth between feeling totally exuberant and absolutely terrified. And as I left work that day and got on the subway to return to my apartment in Brooklyn, I was thinking about what people had said to me. It wasn't just unreasonable what I had done to make this decision. It was risky. It was irrational. I got out of the subway thinking, this was foolish. So I was thinking about this, walking towards my apartment, and then my phone rang. I didn't recognize the number, but I answered it anyway. It was James E. calling. I sold my story, he said. It's going to be a book, and I want you to write it. It was unreasonable to think that that was really happening. But a couple days later, there I was in the offices of a big New York City book publisher. They were completely onto me. Why should we let you write this book? He said. I don't know if you should, I said. Do you know how to write a book? He said. I do not, I said. Do you know how many real writers would kill to write this book? I sure do, I said. Well, then why does James E. want you to write his book? And so I told him what I knew, what I had discovered during these unreasonable months of digging. I knew more about what happened to James E. than he knew himself. None of the allegations about him were ever true. He didn't commit espionage. He wasn't spying. He never even handled misclassified documents. He came under suspicion for knowing too much about Islam, even though knowing about Islam was what he was there to do. He came under suspicion because he was known to pray 5 times a day, and sometimes to gather with other Muslim personnel and pray with them. He came under suspicion because he was known to talk to some of his superiors about his belief that the detainees there weren't being treated fairly, and that it was going against the mission to mistreat their Qurans. He came under suspicion because 2 years after September 11th, he was surrounded by a handful of people who didn't believe that you could be a Muslim and not be a terrorist. A couple weeks later, I was on my way to Guantanamo with a signed book deal and the chance to do some real research. In 2005, Forgotten Country came out, and it was heralded as one of the first inside looks into what was really happening at Guantanamo. And then, surprisingly, the yeses started to come. A year after that, I worked with Elizabeth Edwards on her first memoir about breast cancer and her husband's run for the presidency. A year after that, I worked with John Kerry, then Justice Senator, and his wife, Teresa Heinz Kerry, on a book about some of the most pressing environmental issues facing the nation today. Then I was in Ghana, in West Africa, looking at the slave trade that exists there, where children are sold by their parents. And then to Senegal, where I wrote However Long the Night, about what I think is one of the most interesting human rights movements alive today, a movement to end the practice of female genital cutting. Last year, as Nicole said, Rosewater came out, written and directed by Jon Stewart, and based on the memoir by Maziar Bahari, which I helped to write. Now, I would never argue that I've had the most successful career or that I'm anywhere near the most talented writer, but I have had a very rich career, and I am doing exactly what I've always wanted to do. And I know that none of that would be possible if it weren't for that first unreasonable, irrational decision to take the risk and to go for it. And I also know this. Every single person that I've worked with, all these people that I've had the chance to write with and write about, they've all shared the same thing, this deep sense of unreason, of being told no again and again and going forward anyway, of knowing that there is a rational, practical, and logical route to take and going in the exact opposite direction. Like Pam Cope, with whom I wrote Jansens Gift. In 2006, Pam saw this picture on the front page of the New York Times about this boy named Mark. Mark lives in Ghana, he's 6 years old, and he was a slave. Pam read about how his parents had sold him for $66 to a man who worked as a fisherman, and how Mark worked alongside him 7 days a week for 12 hours a day. She read about how he was often beaten by this man that he called master, and about how the best thing that he could hope for was to grow up and buy some child slaves himself. It was super unreasonable to think that Pam was going to do anything about this kid, right? I mean, she's a mother of 4 in Neosho, Missouri, and Mark is a 6-year-old slave in a very remote village in West Africa. When Pam started to tell her friends that she was thinking that she wanted to figure out a way to help Mark, they weren't shy about telling her how unreasonable that sounded. You're a mother of 4 in Neosho, Missouri. He's a 6-year-old slave in Ghana. You don't have a master's degree in child slavery. You don't even know where Ghana is on the map. And she didn't. And not only that, she was deeply grieving the very unexpected death of her teenage son, who died of an undiagnosed heart ailment. Nobody would have thought it was unreasonable if Pam had never left her couch after that, and now helped this kid who lived in Ghana. 9 weeks after reading this, Pam got on a plane to Ghana, and she pulled Mark off the lake. She found a boarding school to take him in. She raised the money to pay his way. Not only that, she saved 6 other kids with him, including 2 of his siblings. And then a couple months later, she saved some more kids, and then some more. To date, she's saved over 100 kids from slavery, and through the foundation that she started, she's built a permanent care facility for 50 kids who otherwise would have nowhere else to live. So this was the picture of Mark when she saw him. This is Mark today. Now this is Worry Saul, and I would argue that she is by far the most unreasonable woman that I've ever met. She lives in a village called Engarina Bambara in Senegal. And since the time that she was old enough to work, she has been the cutter. This means that she travels from village to village, performing the ritual of female genital cutting. This is a very revered and honored position in her culture, and was passed down to her from generations of women in her family. Like the women, her grandparents, her grandmothers, and all their grandmothers before them, Worry has cut thousands of girls. But then she went to school through a program called Toast On, and she learned about the health impacts of FGC. She learned that the hemorrhaging and infection, and sometimes even the death that came afterwards, were not the result of bad luck or evil spirits, as she had been taught, but because of being cut from an unsterile knife. And she learned that she, yes she, even though she is just a woman, has the right to question any practice that might bring harm. It was unreasonable to think that worry would question the practice of FGC. This ritual is the most important moment in a girl's life, and it has been around literally for centuries. It was unreasonable to think that worry was going to go home to her mother and tell her that she was never going to cut another girl. And not only that, she was going to talk to all the women in her village, and she was going to start a serious dialogue about this practice. She was going to raise the question that, yes, this is a part of our culture, but is it one that we should continue? That's not unreasonable. That's crazy that she would do that. But in 1997, the women of Ngari became among the first African women to stand up and publicly declare an end to the practice of female genital cutting. Worry didn't stop there, though. Instead, she started to walk. She spent days and then weeks and then months walking from village to village, talking to her relatives and all the people surrounding her about what she had learned, about what her village had done. Eventually, she was joined by others, by women and by other men. And because of her unreasonableness and the unreasonableness of legions of women and men like her, more than 7,200 communities have now declared an end to the practice of female genital cutting. In Senegal, and now in Djibouti, and in Guinea, and Guinea-Bissau, and now in Mali, and Mauritania, and the Gambia, and even Somalia. So, to return to my original question, what do you need to do to get a book deal? Or to become a human rights crusader? Or the Secretary of State? Or to finally open that business? Or to teach someone something? Or to create an art center? What do you need to do to lead the most impactful life? I don't know. What do you think?